Okay, appreciate everyone coming out tonight to the meeting and the general business we do. I gave this talk first in 2010 at NARCon. It was in Worcester, which is how you pronounce that. I had learned the hard way. Worcester, Massachusetts, at Clark College, which was really a very nice venue to do a NARCon. And what I enjoyed so much about giving a presentation in one of those classrooms at that college was that was where Goddard went to school and later taught as a professor. So I was really excited to think that I could be in the same classroom that Goddard had been in, and maybe even maybe where he taught. So that was pretty good. Tonight I want to talk about two models of the Aries, one that's 1/50th scale and one 100th scale, and the flights that were made with them, and also tell you how to do a scale model of a full-size rocket, kind of another bit of a modeling lore there. So this picture here is of the rocket flying at Marshall, which I'll talk more about in a minute. I throw in this slide when I was making the presentation that's, since this was about 7 years old, I'll just say that I have been doing model rockets now since I turned 60. I've been doing rockets for 50 years. So I've got one or two days on Bill. I just retired from NASA, having spent 35 years out there. 30 years in Hera, and probably 25 years doing educational rocketry. So enough of my age. Back when in 07 or before 07, there was this rocket called the Ares 1 that Marshall at NASA was doing a lot of work in developing. I had been approached by Steve Cook and Bob Anderson to Armstrong to help them out. Steve Cook had gotten in touch with Estes, and he was in charge of Ares 1, and he wanted Estes to develop a kit, model rocket kit of the Ares 1 that they could sell, and it would get the idea of NASA's new rocket out into where young people in schools could, and the modeling community could enjoy it. So Mike Dofer, who worked at Estes at the time, took the dimensions and he created a 1/100 scale model, which is something like this. Now this is not the version that Mike produced. This is actually was made from a handout from ATK that had this little fold-out brochure that was printed, flat printed pieces of paper that you could cut out and roll together into a rocket kit. And I said, well, that's fine, but it doesn't fly. So I had to build a core for it to have a motor and an ejection charge and have actually made it fly. But it's still the scale that shows you what we were working with. The scale that Estes had made was the same size. And he had sent the rocket to NASA, and they called me up because back then I was the model rocket guy at Marshall. In 07, SLI was really big, and I've always done workshops for teachers and demonstrations for students. And so they knew that I knew how to make a rocket fly, and they didn't. So I got the call, and they said, we want you to go to TARC up in Virginia at Manassas and launch this thing at your field. And I go, yeah, I can do that. So I got familiar with the rocket. I figured out which motor to use, and the slide shows here of me being up at Virginia doing the launch during the demonstration phase of the contest. During the morning, they have the students clock through all of the launches. All 100 teams fly. There's a little bit of a lag in the afternoon where they still fly rockets, but they do a demonstration of high power and anything else of interest. And so this was NASA's chance to get this rocket flown. So I did that. It flew fine, and I was there, representing NASA, and that was pretty good really good day for rocketry and for NASA. I get a call a little bit later, a few weeks or months later. Steve Cook called and Bob Armstrong called me up again and said, well, we want to fly it again. We still have motors, right? So you still have motors, you still fly it. So they said, we want to fly it out in front of the propulsion building. Okay, that's fine, we can do it. And of course I had the launch equipment and everything, and they didn't have that. So they wanted me out there to get the rocket off. What's interesting about this little pad that I brought out, I had built that pad in 1969 when I was a kid, you know, building the rockets, and I used it as my glamour launch pad. And I would set rockets on there, and I would take pictures of them, you know, and pretending they were lifting off, and I would try to take launch shots like this. So I still had that plywood box all these years, you know, floating around in the garage, and I dug it out, and I set it up, and it was pretty interesting that that child's toy was actually used to launch this rocket. So we get out there, and I was expecting there to be a few dozen folks, but suddenly the TV people are out there with cameras, and the newspaper folks, and a lot of media. And so Steve comes out, and I didn't really rub elbows with Steve a lot. He was way above my pay grade. So he was there, and Homer Hickam was there. What is going on here? Well, we want, you know, Homer to push the button and launch the rocket. Okay, so, well, I had to hold the control box so it wouldn't be on the ground. So I'm standing there holding the box. Homer's pushing the button, and Steve is also in the picture, so I'm kind of photobombing the scene to get this rocket flown. But it takes off, and it does really well, and everybody's happy, and that works out real well. A couple weeks later, I get another call. There's a teacher group coming, and they wanted to see the Ares fly, so I got out there and we flew it again. And that's what this picture was about, that was taken with just me launching the rocket, and the flight that made. And what was really interesting about that flight and the same launch is that the rocket went up on an E9. It could fly on a D12-3 pretty well, but an E9-4 was really the better motor for this thing to get it up really well. And it's separated in the top. You had two chutes, the top section and the bottom section. And the bottom section comes down and lands right on the pad. And the guy has a picture of it, which this slide shows. And I was amazed that if that ever happened, to get a picture in front of all the witnesses, but you know, right on the pad. And I said, well, yeah, that's what we do, you know. That's how rockets fly. So that got the rocketry established with flying models. And then Steve Cook comes to me and says, can you make one bigger? Yeah, how big you want to go? Well, we want you to go to TARC again next year and fly something bigger. Okay, so, but you know, we don't have Estes building this other size rocket. So he says, well, can you do it? I go, well, yeah, okay. So I undertook the task, if not an actual job assignment, to build a larger scale flying model of the Ares 1 that would go to TARC and be flown there. And you know, they were going to buy my parts, and I was going to get to do it during work hours, and that was really cool to be able to build models at work. Didn't get a charge code, but still was commissioned to do this. So how do you get started to do a design for a scale model? Well, and then what was I going to do? I wanted to build a scale about 1/50th. I knew the field at Great Meadow was not that large. I didn't want to go over 1,000 feet. I didn't want to get tangled up with high power, so I wanted to try to keep it into a G size motor. I wanted to use available body parts and structural things from products from Aerotech and LOC and PML and off-the-shelf, you know, things that I could build with. And I wanted to go with what we call sports scale detailing. Scale modeling under the NAR guidelines, you have calipers and you have extreme detailing, and you go over it, with a magnifying glass, and you have a really precise version of the rocket. Sports scale means that you have to be able to recognize it at the rocket while it's sitting on the pad. So it's like, oh yeah, that's a Saturn V and not a Saturn 1B. So I didn't want to have a lot of detailing because I didn't want to do that much work for it. I didn't think it was necessary, but I did want to keep all the major features of it. I thought stabilizing it would work out pretty well, and I was really agreeable to a fin can on the bottom to make the thing fly. In this particular design, that bottom can, the black part, is removable, so you can have the whole rocket as a display, or you can put the can in it for the fins for it to fly. And I was going to have plenty of room for a recovery system, but I didn't want to get complicated with dual deploy. I didn't want to mess with staging. I didn't want to get into anything more complicated. Just a dumb, booster rocket with a parachute engine deploy. So to think about the scale, how it's going to look, this is kind of a representation of, you have the 1/100 scale there that I'm holding, and then I'm going to go up to the one that's twice as big. It's going to be about 6 foot long, and then I can dream, this is what the other scales would look like with other larger rockets. And then the smaller one on there, Estes never produced a kit for the Ares 1, but Dr. Zooch did. And that's still available through his store online if you want to get one that's about this long, 18 inches. It's kind of fun, but it's a small rocket. That's how the scaling goes up. I got the dimensions from Steve Cook and Bob Armstrong, and I was excited because I thought that me and Mike Dolfer were the only two modelers in the country, in the world, who had this kind of detail on this new NASA rocket, and that was pretty cool. So he had got it to build his model. I got this, and this was whatever, these changed about every month. The design got changed, and so some of the dimensions would change. But I really didn't need this much detailing as is depicted here, and yet that was still quite a bonanza for all the dimensions on the different and the locations on the different part of the rocket. So I had that. That's the first thing you start of when you're going to make a scale model, is you've got to get as many dimensions as possible from all over the rocket. The next thing you do is you're going to figure out what is your scale factor going to be, and how do you scale the dimensions from the original size rocket down to what your model is going to be. So the way I had a ballpark of how I wanted to start off the size of it, main thing I wanted to do was have that top section a 4-inch diameter tube, because I thought that would be how it would go, and I had 4-inch tubes, and I hoped the rest of the rocket would figure that out. So the original full-size diameter was 216 inches. The tube size that I wanted to get to was 4 inches. So you divide 216 by 4, and you end up with 54. And this was the scale factor is going to be for the entire rocket. It's a unitless number, but it is the number that after I have keyed off those critical parameters that I've matched up, I will then use that scale factor to define the dimensions of the rest of the rocket for the model. So that's the top stage. The bottom stage diameter was 146 inches divided by 54, comes out to be 2.7 inches. Well, that's another win, because there are body tubes that come exactly in that diameter. And so I'm in good shape. Then you can do the scaling for the lengths of the tube and for every respective section of the rocket to build according to those values. And you end up, when you put all of the full scale dimensions in, you can then create this spreadsheet that divides everything by 54, and using inches to inches, you can get the dimensions of what your scale model is going to be at what turned out to be 1/54 scale. So the total lengths, I've got all of the critical sections identified, the aft skirt, the transition stage, the nose cone area and capsule, all these lengths and diameters that I need to find. I get them all printed out here, and I have the numbers of how I'm going to cut the tubes and put the pieces together. In those numbers, I can now go to RockSim and input the dimensions to see if the rocket will fly and what motors will work on it. So I put all of that in, and I began with just a simplified nose cone because the first rocket I wanted to actually build was going to be a boilerplate, just a really rough cut to see if I could get this rocket fly, because I didn't think anybody had ever built a design like this of this particular rocket. So I wanted to be sure that I could make it fly. So you do go to RockSim was what I used, put in all the pieces. I had a fin can idea put together. I built that in the CAD, and there was really no problem. Came out to be easily stable rocket, long skinny design. In fact, they called it the stick when it was an active program. And so that worked out fine. The simulation was going to take the rocket up to about 700 to 800 feet with a G motor, and that was what I wanted. So all of the flight simulation worked out. But I did want to test things because I knew a G motor was where I wanted to go, but I didn't know what really thrust level I wanted or what time delay I wanted, so I was going to have to build the rocket and test it. And of course, we're all project managers, so we have to put a schedule together of how do we do this and when do we get it done and how do we make it work. So I did that counting back from the launch of TARC on May 19th. And pretty well stayed on schedule, close enough anyway. Got it done, so it doesn't matter. I started sketching out how my construction would go together. I wanted the tail section to be removable, but I also used a bulkhead for anchoring the shock cord. This is kind of how I sketched it out in PowerPoint of how the back part worked. This is the front part, how I created the transition and the shoulder to go together. You can take it apart and look at it, see how it works. And then there was plenty of room for a simple recovery system, and I was going to go with Nomex and nylon tubular cord to really have a good premium parts for the rocket. And I had various ways of trying to figure out how it would come down. Basically, it came down like a regular rocket, but one of the later ideas I had was I'd like to get some kind of bridle to keep it from landing right on top of the tower, because a couple of times it did kind of crack and break, and obviously with it coming down nose first, there's a risk there. So I move on and built the thing, took it out to our monthly launch for the month of May, and did some test flights and flew it, I think, first on a G87. The time delay was a little long, and the thrust level was a little high. The thing just really went screaming off the pad, and I wanted something a little slower so it'd be more easier to watch. So I learned that from the testing. And I had used the regular nose cone. I thought was a fair enough representation without having to get into the detail of the capsule. And after that, I was able to refine the RockSim design and put all the actual parts and weights into it and come up with a little bit more better information and flight prediction. But stability was never a problem. The weight distribution all worked out really well. One more test I wanted to do, and this was a few days later. And Steve Cook and Bob Armstrong were wondering, where's the rocket? You know, how's it doing? So I gave them a little bit of a review and also showed the rocket in flight. We flew this actually behind 4203, which is a big field back there. You can tell by the way the hay is rolled where it was. but I was able to refine the motor selection to a G64-4 and the parachute size, and made a really good flight on the rocket. And so after this was done, it was time to take it to the paint shop. What was really nice about building this rocket is I did the technical part of the design and the construction, and then I just took it to the model shop at Marshall, and they were able to paint the rocket and put this finish on it as you see it now, which is really professional and really nice, because I didn't have this. They were able to do the plastic blow mold or whatever it was for the capsule, and they had built other rockets on this scale, so they already had tooling to do it and paint to do it. But what was interesting about the model shop, you figured, oh, this will be really cool. And it was a nice little workshop area where they had all these, everything you would need to build models was in there. But I thought that they're building these exhibit museum class models. They must have some really good precision drawings to work from. And it turned out that I said, how do you get your, what do you work off of to build these? And they had just a 3D rendering printout hanging on the wall. And they look at that, paint the rocket, look at that, cut the rocket. And I thought, well, that's an extremely imprecise way to build a model. I would have thought these things were like engineering models, but they're not. The ones that are on display are to look good and to be nice appearance, but not to be an actual representation. So I was actually building the rocket to a greater precision than they were, but they had the modeling skills, as it were, to really make a good-looking display feature. So I let them do that, and you can see the result here. So now it's time to go to Manassas. We're there Friday night for TARC, and this is Bob Armstrong in the corner. He's there representing NASA and doing a little talk, and this is what the crowd looks like. You've got me down there in the foreground with in the purple, sitting next to Mark Bundick. And I don't know if you can see up here, this is one of our old friends, Pavel from SLI, sitting next to Christine. They're always fixtures at TARC. Their team from Wisconsin is always there. And then 2 rows back is Jesse and Jennifer Sims from Kentucky, who always have a TARC team that goes to TARC and also do SLI. So TARC is like a family reunion. It's gotten to be that way. So they have the meeting. Everybody's gathered there for the briefing on how things are going to be going on. And I got to talk to Tripp. I told him I had a rocket. I was flying for NASA, and it was going to be done as part of the demo. When did he put me in the queue? So he told me when to fly, and he said, you will have 1 attempt. TARC does not let you sit there and fly over and over until your rocket goes up. You have 1 shot, 1 launch window. It's a big deal. There's 1,000 people out there watching. You've got to make it happen. So, yes, sir, aye, aye. That was scary, but at the same time, it was exciting that, hey, I'm going to fly a rocket in front of a bunch of people, and hope it works. So we get out there. It's a beautiful day, and I'm ready to fly. I'm getting around, getting the pictures taken of the rocket, and this picture on the right was actually taken right after the flight with a big smile there, but it worked really well. Spoiler alert. TARC is a big venue. There's a lot of people there. It's a lot of fun. Always worth going to once at least. Big crowd. So I'm loading up the rocket. Got all the parachute put in. Lock it on the pad. It's my time for the cue. They're doing a little introduction that NASA has given, talking about what the Ares 1 is and what the rocket is it's going to fly. And they're starting the terminal count, and it suddenly occurs to me that the entire success of this flight is hinged on the copperhead igniter that came with the motor. Laughter, laughter. And I thought, well, you know, I do pretty good luck with copperheads, and as long as they're not gnarled up and, you know, the pyrogen broken off, and you can kind of peel them apart and get a good grip on the clips, you know, they'll be fine. But I have this, you know, my blood went cold for just a moment. It's like, what have I done? Anyway, the countdown went down, the rocket roars to life, the motor lights up fine. I built it right, the ejection charge worked, it took off and flew, and everybody had a great time, and NASA was impressed because this was the first Ares they'd ever seen, you know, fly on this scale, so they're getting ideas, and it was a tremendous relief, as you all know, whenever your rocket really works in front of a crowd, particularly a crowd of 1,000 from across the country. So I was really happy with that. This is a picture of it right after it landed, out in the beautiful Virginia grass, and rocket was fine. This is with the tail section removed into a display model, and then, you know, there's nice girls at TARC who like your rockets and want to pose with them, so I got a shot of that. So it worked perfectly. Flight was on schedule. It ignited and it flew a good profile. Parachute came out, nothing crashed. Nobody was embarrassed. NASA's integrity was protected, and it was a really good moment for TARC and for Marshall. So that worked out really well. I got one more chance to fly it about a month later. It was time for Take Your Kids to Work, and I had been doing a rocket demonstration for them every year, and I think maybe Bill might have been out helping that year, or at least in other years. And so I still had the pad. I still had a motor left. So I had a motor left. I got to fly the rocket again. So I went out there and loaded it up, and it flew really good for all the visitors and spectators. And I got this Rocket Boys picture at the end of the helpers who went out and found it and brought it back, and I hope that they were inspired accordingly to want to fly some big rockets. So that was kind of the encore. That was lots of fun. The rocket's still here. I think I've flown it once since all of this during a regular Harris Sport launch, and still on a G64 works really fine. The real Ares finally flew in October of '09, which was about a year and a half later. And of course, a big thing that happened during that time was we got a new president, and Ares eventually went away with a lot of other NASA ideas. So there was only one flight full scale that NASA did of the Ares 1, and one flight of a subscale that were flown here. And I was happy to participate with the second one. So that's the story of the Ares models from NASA. Any questions?